In this video, you're going to make the sidebars responsive using Flexbox. So they will occupy each roughly half the width of the container, and also they will have the same height. And this is something you can do easily using Flexbox. So what you're going to do, you're going to make the container of these two sidebars a Flexbox, and then you're going to control their width using the Flex Items properties. So let's go ahead and do this. So at the moment, if you look at the HTML code, you'll see that the sidebars are both inside In this video, you're going to make the sidebars responsive using Flexbox. So they will occupy each roughly half the width of the container, and also they will have the same height. And this is something you can do easily using Flexbox. So what you're going to do, you're going to make the container of these two sidebars a Flexbox, and then you're going to control their width using the Flex Items properties. So let's go ahead and do this. So if you look at the current HTML code, you'll see that each sidebar at the moment is a div, and they're not contained inside a wrapping div. So the first step is going to include them inside a div, which we're going to convert to a Flexbox. So I'm going to copy this content inside a new div, and I'm going to give that div a class sidebars. So first we're going to select the sidebars class and make that div a Flexbox. By setting the display property to flex. So now we've got a Flexbox. Now let's wrap the elements inside the Flexbox by setting the flex wrap property to wrap. And also we need to get rid of the floating or the floats property, as we don't need that anymore with Flexbox. So I'm going to comment this piece of code. Also, I'm going to get rid of the height and width properties, as I don't need that anymore with the Flexbox, since we're going to control that using the flex property later on. So now let's select the sidebars and set the flex property to 1 so that they occupy half the width of the container. So this looks good. So now if I reduce the width of the container, then at a certain point the sidebars go one on top of the other. But we've got a problem here. At this point, you can see that the left sidebar is actually bigger than the right one. And that's because the minimum width that contains the content of this sidebar is actually bigger than that one. So there is a way to fix this by setting the flex basis property instead of the flex grow. So when we set the flex property using a unitless number, we set here the flex grow, which means that we set the flex basis to 0. Now, if I use a percentage, then this will change, and we're setting now the flex basis to 50% instead of setting the flex grow and setting the flex basis to 0. So now if I reduce the width of the container, then the sidebars keep the same width, which is 50% of their container, and then they go one on top of the other at this point. Now we've got a small issue here. If you look at the final layout, there is a small gap between the sidebars, right? So we need to find a way to replicate this in our current layout. Let's add some margin to our sidebars and see if that works. So let's set the margin to something like 10 pixels and see what we get. Well, it didn't work, and basically what's happening here is that the flex basis of each of our sidebars is 50%. So if you add any margin to that, then 50% plus 50% is 100% allocated to the width of the sidebars, plus any margin, then you're actually over 100%, meaning that the sidebars will be wrapped into a new row. So adding a margin is not the right solution here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to wrap each sidebar inside a sidebar wrapper, and then I'm going to give that sidebar wrapper a padding to create that extra space. And instead of having the sidebars as the flex items, we're going to have their wrapper as the flex item inside the Flexbox. So here's how I'm going to do that. So at the moment I've got a sidebars div, which is our Flexbox, and inside this div I've got the left sidebar and the right sidebar. Now instead of having this, I'm going to create a couple of divs with a class sidebar wrapper, and inside each div I'm going to paste the content of a sidebar. So this sidebar is going to go inside this wrapper, and that sidebar is going to go inside that one. Then instead of setting the flex property of the sidebars, these are not the flex items anymore. I'm going to set the flex property of the sidebar wrapper. I'm going to set that to 50%. Now to create that extra space, I'm going to make sure that the sidebar wrapper has got some padding, and let's go for 10 pixels, for example. This will create this extra space. So it's created also some space there, which is fine. Now let's have a look at our layouts and see if everything is okay. Well, it looks like this sidebar is bigger than that one. And this is something we can fix easily by going to the height and width properties of the sidebars and setting that to 100% to make sure that they stretch inside their container. So now if you look again, you'll see that the sidebars are equal in size. Now if I reduce the width of the web page, at some point the sidebars go one on top of the other, and we still can see the padding that we added earlier, which is absolutely fine with our layouts. Now let's increase the size of the browser and make sure that everything looks right. So that's our final layout, and this is our current layout. And they actually look roughly the same. So we can decrease the padding that we added earlier to 5 pixels, for example. So that looks better. Now, something to note about the footer. At the moment, you can see the footer at the bottom of the page because we've got enough content inside our web page. But if we didn't have that, then the footer wouldn't actually stick to the bottom. Now, to make sure the footer always sticks to the bottom, you can always go back to the container where you placed all your items and transform it to a Flexbox. Then you go to the footer and you give it a margin top that you set to auto. This will make sure that the footer is pushed to the bottom of the container or the bottom of the web page. So let's go ahead and do this as an exercise. So I'm going to go to the container and convert it to a Flexbox by setting display to flex. Then I'm going to set the direction to column, and I'm going to make sure the container occupies the full height of the web page by setting the height property to 100 VH. So 1 VH is 1% of the height of the web page. 100 VH is the full height of the web page. All right. Now let's go to the footer and give it a margin top of auto instead of 15 pixels to make sure it gets pushed to the bottom of the web page all the time. All right. So our layout is now complete. Congratulations, you have just made this website fully responsive using Flexbox.